Welcome back to Podcast Answers. If this is the first time that you have been here, welcome. What we do at this show is we help people start and grow their podcast, answering any podcasting questions along the way. And that's right. Today that's not just like any other day. We're answering the same thing. We're answering podcasting questions. We've been doing this for a while, and we love answering questions for people. So today, what are we talking about? We're going to be talking about MP3 versus AAC versus WAV. Like, what file format should you put your podcast out there in? There are so many different podcast formats or different file formats that you could put your file in to create your show. But what is most important? What is the one that's actually going to work for you? We're going to talk about that today. But first, guys, if you've not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe on all of our social channels. You can find us at Podcast Answers, and you can find us there. The only difference is at the Twitter or X, it is Podcast Answers 1, because we could not get Podcast Answers. So with that, guys, we are going to answer your questions now. So what are the different formats and what should you choose? So if you're recording your show, which you should be recording your show, let's say to edit it or whatever, however you're recording your show, you should be recording in a WAV format. That's going to be the format that takes all of the information in. It's going to have all of the depth of everything that your microphone puts out, that your sound puts out, that your show is going to be doing. So it's everything that you're putting in. A WAV file is going to be the file format that you want to be able to record in, so that way you can edit in the best clarity. Now, the downside of WAV files is they are huge. They can be multi-gig big depending on how long your recording is. So if your recording is an hour, your WAV files are going to be extremely huge. And that does not go well over the internet, because that one of the things about the way podcasting works, the files are delivered over the internet. So if your files are huge, they can't handle that. And in fact, most podcasting apps, when they see a WAV file, they're probably actually not going to play it, because it's not the way it's set up to be. So MP3, which is short for MPEG-1 layer 3. So this is a MP3. Most of you have seen it. It's been around forever. It compresses the file size down into a really small size. And it's one of the earlier forms of audio encoding. And you can fit a lot of data onto a small disk. And so if you remember back in the days of when the internet was first starting to come around and become popular, if you're that old like I am, you might remember file trading sites, MP3 trading sites, where you could trade MP3 files of music files. And the reason that worked is because they were small. And so one of the things, this is probably the most popular way to use to encode your files for podcasting. It's going to be all podcast players are going to be able to play MP3 files. One of the things that you are going to want to remember when you're encoding your files as an MP3 is you do want to use a constant bit rate, not a variable bit rate. Some when you're editing your software, when you export it, you sometimes have the option to do CBR or VBR, constant bit rate or variable bit rate. And that is the way that it encodes it. Depending how much data is coming through, it does a higher bit rate. And you want it to be the consistent bit rate, so that way it will work. Most players will handle it funky and try to it just won't work well if you use a variable bit rate. So you don't want to use variable bit rate. You want to use a constant bit rate, or CBR. And you can encode it. For me, I encode it in mine in stereo. I wouldn't need to, because I'm not necessarily playing a I'm not playing a track that's in stereo. So again, stereo being two different tracks of audio, one left and one right. And you can have some audio on your left and some on your right, and you can kind of switch between those. Now, for me, I am not doing anything stereo that needs to be stereo, and I'm mostly just talking in my podcast. So for me, what I do though is I encode mine probably higher than I would need to. I do mine at 128 kbs, and I do mine in stereo. Now, if I wanted to cut my track down to be a whole lot smaller, I could. I could do that into like 96k, and I could go mono. Now, again, that's going to have some effect on the music that I am playing. The music won't quite sound as good as if I did it in 128 bit to 128 bit stereo file. So I do mine 128 bit stereo, even though I'm mostly just doing talking. I still want to have all of that information for me. Now, again, I could cut that down and make it a lot smaller and make it easier to digest. And I think that as a society, we've kind of forgotten that there are still places that we don't get great internet. In many of the places in my office, I get 2 gig down or a gig down, a gig up. Like, that's a lot of data, and that happens very fast. But in a lot of places around the world, they're either paying for the amount of data that they use. So the bigger the file it is, the more that your listeners are going to have to pay. And so as podcasters, it's important that we remember that we should take advantage of that. And maybe if we're not going to offer our main show in a smaller format because maybe we don't like the way that the music sounds or whatever, you can also still offer a lower bit rate file. So that's how many bits per second. And like I said, I normally do mine 128, and I'm doing mine in stereo. But if I really wanted to cut it down, I could go to 96 or even lower, and then go to mono, because that's a lot less data for it to encode. So the pros of MP3s, there's a couple of them. It's going to be widely compatible. Most of your podcast platforms are going to play files as the MP3. They're going to, this is like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and most other podcast apps are going to be playing in an MP3 format. It's compact and it's convenient. And so you are going to be able to, have that large file that was your WAV file and compress it down into something around a meg a minute if you're using 128-bit stereo. Now, some other audio files out there, there's an AAC file, which is Advanced Audio Codec, and it uses a lossy compression encoder to reduce the file size, but better quality than MP3s. But it is the reasons I wouldn't use this is that it's not quite widely as compatible with your podcast apps. Now, it is becoming a more of a standard, but it's still not all of your podcast apps are going to be able to play it. So I would stay away from that and go with your MP3, because that's the tried and true. That's the one we've been using since the beginning days of podcasting. And so you can do that, but I would not do that, because it's going to be, you just might not be able to get your places that play it, because you're going to run into different different issues there, because not every podcast player is going to be able to play your AAC file. So I would stick with something more traditional, like an MP3 that is going to be and you can play around with it. I would try and play around with it and see what the lowest bit rate that you can accept to your ears, and produce it out. Again, this is your file. This is your baby. This is your product. And so if you don't like the way that 60, the bit rate of 60 and this mono file sounds, don't do it. Do it a little bit higher. But again, there are people in the world that can't exactly pull all of that data down because they just can't. They're the infrastructure doesn't handle it in the place in the world they're at, and you still want to be able to talk to them. I mean, this is the great thing about the medium of podcasting, is that anybody can do it, whether it's me who's been doing podcasting for a while, or somebody who's classically trained in radio, or somebody who just wants to get their word out, or my son or my daughter who's never stepped behind a mic can go and they can get it to, they can go ahead and put their content out really easily. And so that's one of the things I really, really like about podcasting, is because you can do that. Now, guys, this podcast is supported by you, listeners like you. If you have something that you want to ask, I would love to hear that. And you can contact me if you have a question. You can contact me at podcastanswers.com/contact. And I would love to answer your question on this show. And we are also supported by you. And so this show does take money to run. And if you would like to help us out, you can go to podcastanswers.com/buymeacoffee, where you can give us a one-off donation or a monthly donation to help keep the cost of this show. And so that way I can keep producing great episodes. Thanks, guys. And until next time, have a great week.